Okay, Ricardo. So we are discussing the auto deployment of components. Okay, so this is the point of what I'm going to think about here is this. Today we deploy omnibus builds. So it's it's our artifact. Our artifact is an omnibus build. Okay, so the problem now is that the Rails code base is updated weekly. More than weekly, because during the week you can fix P1, S1 items, so you can even do more than weekly deployments. But this is something, okay? Then we have the satellite project, so component satellite project, whatever you like. Except from GitLab, which is a special case, the other ones are really, they move really slowly, okay? So it makes no sense to do the weekly thing for those components, because maybe you're just creating branches every week and nothing changes, or there are few changes. So the idea is that those components are stable enough to pick a green master as the current working version. So the idea is that when you do pick into auto-deploy, or when you cut a new auto-deploy branches, you also search for the latest green master on this component, and you select that SHA as the new version of the component.
So I have a question.
Okay, let me finish for a moment. So that's the thing. Now, what's the problem here? To say that what we discussed in the issues is how can we ensure that everything is compatible? Okay, and so this is my question. The question is, how are we ensuring this now? We're doing manual QA because it's up to the maintainers of the component to make sure that when they upgrade the component version in GitLab repository, they know that that version of GitLab can run with that component. But this is not enough. That's why I'm telling you that when we work on pages, workhorse, and GitLab, we keep backward compatibility, because you don't know what happens during a deploy. The workhorse usually restarts faster than unicorns, for instance. So Omnibus kicks in, replaces binaries, and starts sending signals, okay? So you have connection incoming with the new workers that may reach an old unicorn. So new proxy implementation, old Rails code base. So this is already the case, even if we ship everything together. So when we change something in pages, workers, GitLab, we make sure it can at least handle previous version of the code.
I don't agree with that, because like developers know that in order to bump a version of pages, for example, you need to go to GitLab and edit pages version file. And I've seen that like multiple times, that we are introducing incompatible changes in satellite. And we know that we need to go to GitLab project to change something there, or perhaps some other satellite. And only when, you know, the change has been merged in GitLab, then we know we can bump a version of GitLab pages there. And that,
yeah, but this is not the case. I mean, when you have two components, you still have to select the priorities. So there's a change which is backward compatible and one that can't be. Do you agree with this? So one of the two components can be backward compatible, but then the other one will implement something that will change the behavior of the other one. So you can say that you have something that is backward compatible and something that can drive the options. So based on version of the second component, the new or the old code path in the other activates, okay? Imagine you're adding our parameters to our query or whatever, you add new routes, things like that. So we have multi-project dependencies in merge requests. So the thing is that as an engineer, you select which one is the backward compatible and which one is not. And so you made the uncompatible change not related, but yeah. And compatible change is as a prerequisite the backward compatible implementation, so that it cannot be merged until the other one is in. And this gives you the thing. Then on Rails, you also have feature flags. So you can even build on top of that. So you can still have backward compatible again. But the point is that as a reviewer and maintainer in the satellite projects, or in general, in Rails, you should aim to backward compatible. And this is regardless of the auto deployment of components or not. Because we can't hope for the best during a GitLab.com deployment. And there's a moment when you don't know the state of the fleet or which version is running where. So this is something like the code n on schema n+1.
So my point is that I understand that it is interesting solution, but my point is that without versioning, you sometimes can't implement backwards compatibility in a component that you are developing. I do agree that we need to develop components in a way that they are backwards compatible. But if you do not know which version of a satellite you are dealing with, or which version of Rails coordinator you are dealing with, like you can't implement this conditional somewhere to make it backwards compatible.
I agree, but we did this in the runner in the past. It's not about version, it's about capabilities. So you need a way for there's always a component that is driving an interaction. Okay, so let's say something comes in from workers and workers control some behaviors, so they can change the route that it proxies to, or the runners pick a job from GitLab, and GitLab can change the JSON, the representation of the runner, triggering a new or an old behavior. So once you have this, you have conditionals. So it's not about knowing that this is Rails version XYZ, because versions means nothing. You want to know that this GitLab Rails can handle feature X, Y, and Z.
It's not sometimes about handling feature, but how you handle them. It's more about, it's more low level. It's more about JSON schemas that might be compatible or not. And I don't know how to explain that. It's very difficult to comprehend. But what I'm trying to say is that I feel like without versioning, sooner or later we will hit a wall with how to implement backwards compatibility. And my worry is that relying on GitLab QA on end-to-end tests is completely, useless strategy, because end-to-end tests are at the top of testing pyramid. What they cover may be very minimal. And having a team working on end-to-end tests to add more and more and more, this is not a good way to ensure that everything works.
Well, let me tell you an example, because there is a problem here that we have components right now that just, I would say, they works by chance. Okay, so there's no in real tests between pages and Rails interactions. We rely on the fact that both components are testing the interface, but there's no common point where we ensure that they are testing the same interface.
Have you ever heard about Pact project?
The Pact is the thing that builds images for the one from HashiCorp, or another one? Okay, no.
The Pact is a testing framework that makes it possible to test components independently, but they are still you test one component with some interface, then you test second component with some interface, but whenever you test one or the another, there is a Pact specification being generated, and then you test the specification against another component.
Okay, so you can, okay. Yeah, it works for interfaces, if you also have timing or things like that, can be more, but yeah, it's definitely more than what we have, and something that we should look for. But the thing that the point was that I want to make is that today there's no real testing for this. Okay, so what happens is that the maintainers ensure the quality, and if it fails,
compatibility.
Yeah, the compatibility, not the quality, the compatibility. So
yeah.
they ensure that we are switching version in the right moment. The semver thing is just an helper, just tells you that you break something, that you upgraded the measure version, so you know that you changed something and you should pay more attention to it. But this is just moving the problem from merge request review to release. But the problem is still there, because when you do the review, you have to understand that there is a breaking, this is breaking the API, and then you have to remind yourself to prepare a build that upgrade the major versions and do everything to make sure that things doesn't break. So the problem is still there. What I'm telling here is that there's another problem that we have today, and that is features in workers, pages, Gitly, mostly Gitly, because Gitly is tested in both sides, because Gitly is used for testing GitLab Rails, requires manual handling for this. And there's no need if you can automate this part. So that if something is merged, is ready, then you can pack this into the current Rails, GitLab Rails, and try it. And if it fails the same way as it fails with a maintainer doing the heavy lifting. So you have still to roll back. I mean, it's not rolling back, it's creating a new release that changed the version back to the working one.
I'm not sure, because first of all, I think that using QA to check if something fails or not is the effort. Like, it's work that needs to be done on compute nodes. Whereas if you have a semver, you can just compare some strings and you know that this.
No, but I got your point, but this is not the thing, because someone has to make sure that this is really compatible. Because you're
like
just
there we
comparing
run tests, but before we run tests, we have preliminary data about whether it's compatible or not. I'm not saying that we should not run smoke tests. I'm saying that before we run smoke tests, we need to resolve dependencies. And I get it that it might work right now. In the moment where we are, having omnibus and creating an artifact.
Yeah.
But I think that the only thing that is going to help us eventually move towards CD is that we need to have a way to run like 10 components of GitLab in the production with 3 different versions, or 4. Let's say that every component can live with 4 different versions on a production. So let's say that we have potentially 40 different versions of software components running in production. How do you resolve dependencies and route requests to proper versions without having versions?
Yeah, but again, I do understand your point. It's definitely something we should look for when we move to independent components, so that all the effort in Helm charts and things like that, because you can imagine someone bumping Gitly version and, oh, what happens? I mean, Gitly should work if it's a newer, because it's backward compatible, but you don't know what happens, okay? So I do agree. What I'm telling here is that we still have to keep in mind that we ship software to our customer in a packages format. So the idea is that as soon as we make this, as you told, independently deployable, you need something that can, at runtime, tells you if there are incompatibility. Because this is the point of checking.
There is, of course, the runtime, compatibility check, and I think that in microservices world we basically achieve that by routing nodes that can understand the version header, something like that. But what I'm trying to say is that we can follow the same approach that you are proposing right now and still have versions, semantic versioning files, so that first you see if a package that you are trying to build from masters, let's say latest branches, all those, you collect all those versions and you see if it seems like compatible compared to what we had before. And that's a way when you could move forward, like with what we are having now, or what we are planning to have now. But this is an information that you might need to have in order to resolve dependencies when building the artifact. And then we can, of course, take the artifact that we have built and test it and do everything we want.
Yeah, but the point is that if you merge something that breaks the compatibility, then you are blocking all the future development until someone declares that this thing is now compatible. So this is the point that is hard to solve. So is it better to stop that merge request from being merged?
Just
keep everything?
We are talking about not compatible nodes, but the component. My worry is that what we are trying to model right now is that compatibility goes one direction, but compatibility goes two directions. For example, you can introduce a new feature, which means that this component is still backwards compatible, but you need to have the new feature consumer. And if it does not have it, like the feature is not compatible, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but okay. But that's the point. If you add something new, it's backward compatible by definition because you don't change the old one. If you introduce a consumer in the system that relies on this new feature, then I agree we have to keep this working. So if you downgrade the nodes or something like that clients breaks.
So let's like the current example with pages is really interesting because we want to implement a new feature. So on GitLab we will have the new API that GitLab will, so the GitLab version is always backwards compatible with the old version of pages because it's not using the new feature.
Sure.
But once you deploy new version of pages, it requires the newest GitLab. So okay, so there is back compatibility problem here. And that's the opposite direction if you introduce something new in pages. So my point is that compatibility is bidirectional, and my bet is that without having versioning, you are not able to resolve bidirectional compatibility.
Yes, I do understand, but how? Because you are suggesting to, let's say, write the version in a file, for instance, so that you don't tag it, because you continuously deploy for things to get merged. So this is, I mean, if I understood correctly, so instead of checking the tag, you're checking the content of this file, which is in the repo, and tells you remove the minor, because it could be something like measure minor. Yeah, the patch version is the SHA, whatever. But
the version file is better than tag because it comes at the same time with merging.
And exactly. That's the point.
Raise condition with tagging. But yeah, so what is your question then?
Yeah, the point is that what I'm trying to say is this, that let's look at the pages example, okay? Mm-hmm. So I do expect the new pages daemon to be backward compatible if Rails uploads the content in the file system. Okay, so the way they works now, no APIs, just the sidekick jobs kicks in, boom, create the content. So and the pages will pick up the content and start serving it. So if you upgrade pages before upgrading Rails to the new API, no problems. Nobody will use the new features and pages, and it will still work because Rails, the sidekick nodes just deploy the artifacts in place. Once you know that the pages installation are deployed, you can activate the new features in Rails. So I don't get the bi-directional part in this example, because you expect people to run, let's say, 10 years old, 10 years old, let's say 1 year old version of Pages and upgrade only Rails and then breaking stuff. I mean,
No, that's not. So the example is that we have a new feature in GitLab Rails. It exposes a new API, and we deploy that to GitLab. Then in Pages, we need to introduce the client that is going to ask GitLab about some configuration through API instead of traversing file system.
The file system.
So it means that once we introduce new functionality to GitLab Pages, it needs to have access to new Rails endpoint.
Yeah, which, okay, go ahead, sorry.
And GitLab Pages is still backwards compatible, but it means that the previous version, so we are adding a new version of GitLab Rails, and we are just adding a new feature. We are not breaking contracts with clients. But then, once we introduce a new feature, the old version of GitLab is no longer compatible with GitLab Pages.
With Pages, right.
So, and my point is that situation like that can happen in two directions. And I feel like it's very difficult to resolve that dependency. So
are you thinking about someone managing the installation from sources? I mean, because the point is, if you control the release cycle, how can this happen?
How this can happen? So we need to deploy a new version of GitLab somehow, and once we do that, we never do everything at once. So always the previous version is going to exist and the new version is going to exist. And then you need to somehow coordinate the deployment of Pages. And also the old version of Pages exists and the new version exists. So at the same time, we have 4 versions and half of them is not compatible with the another half.
Yeah, but the way because this is a problem that we already have today.
Not really, because we have the Pages version in GitLab Rails.
Yeah, but on the 22nd, when you release and you install the new deployment, you have a fleet of machines, half of them upgraded, half of them not. And on the same fleet of machine, binaries process can be restarted not in the same order. So it's a smaller time frame.
Kind of works, but the time frame is so small that it's not causing problem.
No, it is, because for GitLab.com, it's a problem. By the way, this is still a problem. So what I'm telling you is that it's not only checking the version, it's making sure that in that tiny spot, things still works. And we are already doing this for Pages, Workers, and I think also Gitly. So this is what I'm telling you, that because this already exists, it's up to us as engineer to figure out which is the client driving the interaction. So what are the requirements in this period of time that can be expanded now, but it still happened, and make sure that we do things in step, so that this deployment, new features comes in, but the other one is not consuming. So let's wait a week, 1 day, whatever it is, and you know that everything, the fleet is upgraded and is stable, is functional. Then it's back to you. Trigger feature flags, deploy a new version, do what you think it is.
Yeah, so I think it's basically difficult.
It is hard. It's really, really, really hard.
Hard. And my gut feeling is that it's more important to have version, not to actually be able to build the omnibus artifact, but to carry the version in all the headers of all the interactions between components, so that
you can inspect and route
uncompatible version. And without that, it might be difficult. So what I'm afraid of is that the change we are making right now removes the need of having versioning, whereas it's super important to have it, but perhaps not to build a package, but to have this version in all the headers and all the interactions, so that you knew that you are talking to incompatible version, or that you are an incompatible version and that you need to respond to something else. Because currently we assume that GitLab coordinator is always a server, whereas all the satellites are always a client. What we know is not necessarily true. And
that's not necessarily true. I do agree, but it depends on the features you're working on. You have to figure out which is driving the interaction.
I find it like super interesting discussion. I need to finish now because my son needs to be picked from the kindergarten, but that's super interesting discussion, and I'm happy that I could chat with you about that. So I still think that basically what delivery team is working on right now is probably the mission critical stuff, probably one of the most important things we can work on. So we never have enough of discussions like that.
No, definitely. No.
For me, it's super important. Thank you very much, Alex. I really appreciate that you could spend some time talking with me.
No problem. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.